brought to the Dayton area initially with the Air Force as an officer. He served as an Air Force officer for 6 years and has since retired and decided to make his home here, and he is a member at the West Mason Church. I was fortunate to get to know David and become friends with him in Cookeville, Tennessee at a preacher training seminar in 2015. And tonight, David will be speaking to us about God's plan for Jacob. So I ask that you give him your kind attention. David.
Thank you for that great introduction. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. Can you hear me okay? Do I have the lapel? You can hear my nasal breathing a little bit maybe there, but so wonderful to be here this evening. I want to thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity to speak with you for just a little bit. You made a good decision by being here this evening, not to come to see me, obviously, but to hear the Word of God, and I think you could have been anywhere else and you made a decision to be here. That's admirable. We're continuing the summer series here of people fitting into God's plan. Last week, we heard a great lesson by Brother Jason Schofield on Isaac. I want you please to forget how good of a job that he did and bring those standards down a little bit for me here this evening. No, I'm just kidding. He did a fantastic job, and it was really a pleasure to be here and to hear about Isaac. I hope that this evening, as we listen a little bit about the life of Jacob, that you will not see me, obviously, but in this you'll see the words of Christ, and that we can learn from his life and his example. You should see the handout in the sections there. Towards the end, the last few slides, we will be focusing on that, the practical application piece of the lesson. I'll tell you when we will be referring to that. But you can take notes on that as well. So we're going to be talking about God's plan for Jacob, the man who wrestled with God. Psalm 23, as many of you would know by heart, I thought fit perfectly in considering Jacob. God provided for Jacob. He made a table for him and before his enemies. He led him to still waters, and ultimately restored his soul. Surely of any man who walked the earth, Jacob resides in the house of the Lord forever. But Jacob did not start out that way. And what I hope we can take away this evening is a clear understanding that God cares not about our past. He cares about what we do with our future. We will look at the life and times of Jacob, the man who wrestled with God and with man, and prevailed. God would use him to bring forward the nations of Israel, his people fulfilling the nation promise, as Jacob would be the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel. But this man Jacob, as we see today, was not perfect. A study of Jacob reveals much more than the life of just a simple biblical character, but rather a real flesh and blood man who struggled with God and with men, had great challenges both internal and external. Jacob demonstrates a detestable character, manipulative and controlling at times. He lies, cheats, steals, is cowardly, deceives, doubts, fears, and becomes depressed. He learns poor habits from his family and deals with immense conflict, strife, and disorder within his family. And yet through it all, God uses him, and his character changes as he faces towards God. In just a few minutes, we'll look at these stages of Jacob's life that you see up here on the screen, and how encounters with God and turning his face towards God would change in him and his character and make him a better man. Again, I hope I can impress upon you this evening for the purpose of showing God's immeasurable love, mercy, grace, and patience, that Jacob's life was full of just about everything that one from the outside looking in might consider abominable behavior. And by being able to relate to his weaknesses and seeing that God loved him and used him in the line of Christ, we can know that God also loves us. So as a point of reference, here's a map. I should probably point out things on it that are important to us. I suppose here, if you can see it, it's very difficult, but the red line going from Beersheba all the way up to Haran is the first time that Jacob flees. He's running away then from his older brother Esau for fear of his life, and he would head up to Haran where he would work for his uncle who would become his father-in-law, Laban, for 20 years. The green line there you can see coming back down is when he'd be running then from Laban. And this time he would encounter God and his brother Esau. Now I'm going to just kind of go through here some of the locations that are important to Jacob's life. You see Beersheba there, Bethel, and Hebron. Beersheba is Jacob's city of birth. He would deceive Isaac and Esau here. In later life, he would stop the sacrifice to God here and seek guidance as he embarked onto Egypt, where Joseph, his son, was still alive. Bethel is the location that Jacob would first encounter God in a dream and make a vow. Later, upon his return as an older man, Jacob would again renew his vow and build an altar there to worship God. In Hebron, Jacob would last see his father Isaac alive while dwelling there. Here he would make a coat of many colors for Joseph, and he would live here until he left for Egypt to see his son Joseph alive again. And at the end of his life, he would die in Egypt and would be carried back to Hebron and laid to rest in the family tomb along with his fathers Isaac and Abraham. Here is Haran. Haran, located in the land of Paddan Aram, is where Jacob would reside for 20 years with Laban. He would marry Leah and Rachel, and here he would have 12 children who would be the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Here in Haran, the Lord was with Jacob and blessed him richly with many blessings. Peniel, lastly, are tours of locations that were effective to Jacob's life. This is the pivotal location where Jacob, later in his life, would pray to God for deliverance from his brother Esau. Situation was completely out of his control. He would encounter God, wrestle with him, prevail, meet his brother Esau, who he believed would kill him and make at last a peace. Here it reads that the exact location is not known, but it would be near the crossing. I don't know if I can laser point it here. Near the crossing of the Jordan and Jabbok rivers. Now, before we go on, I want to set up before we go on to set up what the man of Jacob was, it's important to know where he fell in the lineage of Christ. I threw up here this messianic genealogy to show just the grand scale of how God works. In all these people, God would show true faith, love, and work in their broken lives, using all things for the good of those who loved him. Last week, we saw the life of Isaac. We're looking at Jacob. And through Jacob and his wife Leah, we would have Judah born of the 12 tribes, which would be within this great succession to Christ. Again, remember the scope, the scale upon which God works, that these are real men and women. And then as they fit into God's plan, with all their faults, we can see God's immense love. Jacob's close family here, for all those who are Ancestry.com buffs, here we can look at Jacob's family here. Leah, Zilpah, her handmaiden Rachel, and Bilhah. Leah would be Jacob's first wife, as we know, Rachel the second. Given to Leah was Zilpah, her handmaiden. Rachel would have Bilhah. It is not clear if Zilpah and Bilhah were also daughters of Laban or related in some way, but their place in God's plan would be to mother many children for Jacob and bring forward those 12 tribes of Israel. Often confused is that many think that Joseph is in the line of Christ, the son of Rachel. It is in fact Judah, as we know, son of Leah, that the ultimate love of Christ would be brought forward through the lineage. That is not to say that Joseph is not important in any way. As a small aside, Joseph's lineage would bring forward the people of Ephraim, which we hear of often in the Old Testament, and they would later lead the northern kingdom. But talking about his immediate family, those that were close to him in his formative years. First, we want to consider Isaac, who we heard from about last week. As we learned last week, Isaac was a man of God, dutiful and obedient. He himself was the son of Abraham through Sarah. Isaac carried with him the promises of God for a land, a nation, a blessing to all peoples. And Abraham was told to God that those he cursed would be cursed, and those he blessed, he would bless. Through Isaac, there was two things that would play a part in Jacob's life, a pivotal part, a birthright and a blessing. Both of these would rightly belong to Isaac's favorite son, Esau, the firstborn. Rebekah, his mother, sister of Laban and aunt of Rachel and Leah, Rebekah would come from Paddan Aram, where in Haran, where Jacob would later flee. Rebekah's brother Laban and her family resided there. Unfortunately, as it relates to Jacob's life, we do not see a very good side of Rebekah. These family influences that she carried, Jacob would be quick to adopt. Rebekah displayed characteristics of distrust. She would favor Jacob over Esau, and her actions would ultimately be those of some manipulation within the family, lying to her husband. Of note, the consequence that we see of those actions is that when she sends Jacob away to protect him from his brother Esau, she would lie to Isaac saying that it was so that he could find a wife. This lie would essentially cost her the ability to have Jacob, or the chance to have Jacob in her life, as we have no account of them seeing each other before her death. Esau, her older brother, or Jacob's older brother, was by right the carrier of the birthright and the blessing of Isaac. As we know, he was a hunter, a man of the field, but through the life of Jacob, we can see that Esau had a great blessing, but didn't value it until it was way too late. Esau would hate his brother Jacob for his deception, only to forgive him later, but the forgiveness was likely not true forgiveness. In Hebrews 12, verse 6, we see the picture of Esau, that he would focus so much on the physical life that he would trade his birthright for a meal, as we know, trading it as profane. Esau's forgiveness of Jacob's deception would be rooted for his lack of care for the birthright. It meant nothing to him. Later, Esau would marry the daughters of the Hittites, which would grieve his parents greatly. They would become the lineage of the Edomites, which were known as idol worshippers. Ultimately, we can see in Esau much of what we might see in the man of a person in the world, or in a man of the world. By outward appearance, hardworking and even fair at times, but inwardly not having regard for spiritual things, and often forsaking them for physical desires. Hebrews 12 accounts Esau as profane, unholy, or godless, depending upon the translation. Moving a little bit forward in Jacob's life is Laban, his uncle, and his father-in-law. Sadly, we see many of the same characteristics that we saw in Rebekah and Laban, leading to an important lesson we can draw, that a godly family can have a great impact on a person's life, but also likewise, poor habits in the home can spread through many generations. Laban would acknowledge the God of Jacob as being a great blessing to him, and would desire that Jacob would stay with him. Desire that Jacob would stay with him because of those blessings. But ultimately, he would have idols of foreign gods. He would treat Jacob poorly, and in many ways, he would be used by God to teach Jacob many valuable lessons. Laban was unfair to Jacob, but at a point that will speak well of Jacob, he was fair and faithful to Laban through many unfair situations and accusations. Lastly, as we're looking here at his immediate family, is Leah and Rachel, the daughters of Laban, the nieces of Rebekah and cousins of Jacob. Through no fault of her own, Leah was not as beautiful as Rachel, but was the firstborn in the custom of the land in which she lived. She would need to be married off first. Laban would deceive Jacob, as we know, in the same way that Jacob would have deceived his father. As a small aside, I would like you to consider, I always wondered how Jacob didn't know that it was Leah, right? Have you ever wondered that? I've always wondered that. How did he not know? Well, it is as a way to show the amazing ways in which God's providence can teach us. The custom of that time was to have a thick veil placed over the face of the woman during the wedding ceremony. It stayed there throughout the whole ceremony. This would make the husband blind, in effect, to her until after the ceremony was over and the wedding was binding, then last revealing herself to him. This same blindness is what allowed Jacob to deceive his father Isaac. Rachel, on the other hand, was very beautiful and a woman whom Jacob loved. She would, however, mirror many of the same family tendencies that her father Laban had and Rebekah had: deceit, lying, manipulation. She would steal and hide her father's idols, lie about it, and between her and Leah there was a great jealousy and conflict. God, however, would use that conflict, and he would allow Jacob to bring forward 12 sons, one daughter, and this would cause, however, at the time, it would cause Jacob a great many headaches. So he thought, wow, my family was bad. You know? Jacob had a lot of difficult times with his immediate family. But now as we consider the man himself, Jacob, and where he came from and who he was surrounded with, let's examine his character and see again that God can use even the most vilest of persons for his own good when they turn to him. The story of Jacob can be broken up into 3 distinct times, and between these periods we see a different man in each different period. Quite often many will say that a person cannot change. They cannot change. They'll be the same forever, no matter what they do, and that is simply not true. It is absolutely false to assume that someone or anyone cannot become a better person. They can, and they do so by turning their face to God. Jacob is the prime example of this. The life of Jacob is referenced throughout the Bible many times. But it is seen in Genesis chapter 25 through 49. And as I was told, I have about 2 hours. So we're going to read Genesis chapter... Nope, just kidding. I highly, highly encourage you to read the life and story of Jacob in Genesis 25 through 49. If you haven't, read it. If you have, read it again. We've heard many of the things and stories and some of the ways in which Jacob's life can influence us, but I beckon you to read it again, not focusing on the switching up of his wedding night or of the man who wrestled with God, focusing on those pivotal events, but focus on the weaknesses that this man had, that he failed many, many times, but he grew and matured as he turned towards God. And this is what we want to take away this evening. In chapter 25, going back to the very beginning, Jacob was born to Isaac and Rebekah in Isaac's 60th year. He was the younger of twins, him and Esau. Esau was a hairy man, named literally for meaning hairy, and he was what you would call a man's man, a hunter and a man of the field. And I'm going to be talking about Jacob's life as it came to me as I was reading it in a narrative format, some that we can draw main points from. So again, please read it, 25 through 49. It's amazing. Jacob would reach out and grab Esau's heel, earning him the name that means supplanter, or one who grabs at or holds onto the heel of another. In Jacob's life, we would see him living up to this name. In chapter 25, we see him, Esau coming in out of a field, famished, and Jacob offers him a bowl of red stew for his birthright. This is an act that takes advantage of Esau's situation. And though Esau did not need to take it, Jacob also had no right to the birthright. Later in chapter 27, later in chapter 27, Jacob, at the behest of his mother, would lie to his father. There we go. I'll just build this slide out. There we go. Okay. Would lie to his father. He would steal Esau's blessing. This is the birthright and the blessing. Then when confronted with the anger of Esau, instead of facing him, the man who he cheated, Jacob would display cowardice and fled, again under the guise of a lie to his father, to the land of Haran. And then something happens, something pivotal in his life. As he fled his brother, Jacob would stop in Bethel to rest his head on a stone. And in his dreams, God would show him a ladder that was descending up into heaven, and angels would be ascending and descending on it. God promised Jacob a people, descendants, a land, and that he would be with him and keep him wherever he went. What is interesting in this encounter is that we see Jacob making a vow to God in chapter 28, verse 20 and 21. In much the same way that you might say, God, if you get me through this, I will never watch another TV show, never binge watch another Netflix series. In that same way, Jacob would make a vow or a deal with God. He says that if God does what God says he's going to do, then he would be Jacob's God. In this moment, we see Jacob is in distress. He's fleeing for his life. He would turn towards God, recognize his power and his awesome presence, and make a vow to serve him. Unfortunately, the ways that he was leaving behind, those of manipulation and deceit, they would still influence him. As the vow he made to God was almost like controlling the situation in which he was in. We'll see this in the next portion of his life. Still a note that we would consider. Unlike our off-failed, God, if you get me through this, I will never lie again, vows that we make, Jacob would keep his vow to God, denoting that after he had turned his face to God, he had underwent a change in his character. This leads to the middle portion of Jacob's life. A man who is maturing but still has a lot to learn. We can see in Jacob's life that he has largely to this point forsaken manipulating others. Instead, in many of his dealings with Laban, Jacob shows fairness and hard work. He keeps his word with Laban, with God, and he fulfills his end of his deals. However, even though Jacob may have given up manipulation and deceit, he still attempts to do what we all do. He tries to control his life on his terms. The vow he made to God we could see as being very selfish, a vow for himself. If you, God, do all the things you said, and you do them for me, then I will serve you, effectively is what he vowed. God would use Laban to show him the feebleness of attempting to control his life and the outcome of his life. Laban's dealing with Jacob can be seen as very one-sided, advantageous, deceiving, and in many ways the same nature of dealings that he had to manipulate other men that Jacob had been doing. Laban struck a deal with Jacob to work for Rachel for 7 years. Then he would deceive him with Leah. Then he would work for another 7 years for Rachel. Later, Jacob would try to leave, but Laban would entice him to stay, to work on for another 6 years, and it would take Laban changing his wages, Jacob's wages, 10 times, assumingly not for the better, before Jacob would realize that he would need to flee to get away from Laban. Laban would pursue Jacob, accuse him of dealing falsely and stealing his idols, which Rachel had taken, and stealing his children, his grandchildren. Jacob assumed the family to be his, attempting again to control the situation. He would make a covenant with Laban, agreeing not to pass a certain point, that if he had done anything to the daughters of Laban, that God would be a witness to it. After this incident of fleeing, Jacob would attempt to make another deal, another attempt to control his life by sending word to his estranged brother Esau, whom, when he had last left, wanted to kill him. I read this deal in chapter 32 as to say, I have many things here with me. They could be yours, and if it finds favor with you, please come to me. Then in the mind of Jacob, a disaster happens. Messengers would return that say that Esau is bringing 400 men, an army, to come and see him. To Jacob's mind, he's coming now to take by force all that I have and avenge on me the deception that I had done to him. How Jacob deals with this is to send ahead of him many presents. He sends them ahead, and they put distance between him and those presents. So they get to Esau first, attempting to win Esau's favor over. Finally, after there was nothing left that he could do, being stripped of all his resources, finding himself alone and afraid, another great thing happens in Jacob's life. A point to take away here is that God meets us in the moments when we have finally exhausted all other options, in an attempt for us to turn at last to him. So when Jacob wrestles with God, and afterwards we see a humbled man. This is where the rubber meets the road for Jacob. By literally wrestling with him in hopes that we will see him, Jacob, instead of hardening his heart, is humbled by this experience. This leads to another change in Jacob's character, one now of forsaking control and turning towards obedience. In the later period of Jacob's life, it shows us of a man who has matured but still has moments of doubt and fear and depression. Jacob was now forsaking the methods he had used before of manipulation and deceit, and attempts to control the outcome of his life. He begins to trust and obey God. Throughout chapter 35, we see Jacob obeying the commandments of the Lord. When told to go back to Bethel, dwell and put up an altar to God, Jacob not only does so, but he turns his influence on his family and tells them to put away their foreign gods. Then he leads his family in the ways of God, telling them to purify themselves. And God blesses them and keeps them as he had promised. Jacob would earn his new name of Israel, one who strives with God, as he faced a great many challenges in his life. Most importantly, the challenges he faced was within himself, to change himself to be the man that God wanted him to be. But despite all that he was still a man. And most importantly for us to see, he was not perfect, and no man is perfect. When he had his sons, he, like his father before, would favor one of his sons, which would lead to strife and conflict within the home. When he thought Joseph, his favored son, to be dead, he was stricken with grief and depression. He did not live up to the responsibilities that he had at the time to his family because he would not allow them to console him. Later in Joseph's dealings with his brothers in the famine, Jacob would assume a mistake was made with the golden grain that had been returned, doubting God's providence or doubting in his mind God's ability to take care of him and to keep his family through the famine. He would despair when he saw that Simeon had been left behind in Egypt throughout the famine. He would think that all was against him. He would turn to some of his old ways to try to take control of the situation and win favor in the eyes of this Egyptian leader who had been dealing with him and his sons. Much in the same way that he tried to win over his brother's favor, sadly, he would assume that Benjamin would die, and possibly all of his sons would die, giving into a defeated heart. But God, as he had promised, would not leave Jacob. And when through the course of the events that Jacob found that Joseph was still alive, his spirit was revived. He then left his home and went to Joseph, stopping in Beersheba to offer sacrifices to God. God then again came to his faithful servant Jacob and assured him he would safely go back to Egypt and come back from Egypt. Through faith, trust, and obedience to God, Jacob experienced a great many physical and, more importantly, spiritual blessings in this life. And finally, at his death, he'd be gathered back to his people and buried in Hebron, in a tomb with his father Isaac and Abraham. We've heard a lot about Jacob. And I hope that I've impressed upon you in this narrative format the challenging issues that he dealt with, both internal and external in his life. You may think your life hard. Your challenge is unique. Jacob had more. And when he found that he could not handle things on his own, he turned to God. Now we can turn here to God, and Now here, we're going to pick up our handout. Now here we're going to pick up our handout for the practical application portion of how God uses Jacob's life to show us a great many things about himself, about his own character. Firstly, and most importantly, for us to understand about the character of God is that he demonstrates his long suffering for us. The man Jacob was, at any time, for any of the offenses that he conducted, God could have killed him, condemned him, punished him, and he would have been justified for it for the man that Jacob was. But Jacob was never sentenced for any one moment in his life. Likewise for us today, God again and again assures of his patience and his forgiveness. He describes himself as our Father, and we his children, our God, merciful and gracious, forgiving of our many iniquities and transgressions, full of compassion, and not willing that any should perish. Jacob's life wasn't just a string of bad events driven by poor choices. It was a tapestry upon which God painted his everlasting love, showing again and again his willingness to be patient with us and to come to him because he wants us to be with him. The second insight into God's character that we can draw and we see from the life of Jacob is he is willing to wrestle or strive with us. Jacob is exactly like every one of us, and like every person who has ever come to God's word. He doubts, fears, tries to control it, maybe manipulate, lies, cheats, steals, many other things that would be abominable in a sense. He quite literally wrestled with God. But put aside for a moment the physical wrestling that he had with God and consider for yourself. Do you wrestle now with God over a situation in your life, something in your life? God may wait until you're alone. Let us try all of the other options. And as Jacob was, finds us and wrestles with us to try to get us to turn to him. He wants us to taste and see that his way is good. Be still and know him. To strive to enter through the narrow gate. To compete for the prize. To press on towards the goal. All while knowing who we were and forgiving us all the same. As such were some of you, the list of great sins that pours forward, and God says, what sin? Wrestle with me about it. and you will see how I deal with your sin. Jacob's life wasn't a bunch of learning moments strung together that he happened to stumble upon and make the right choices in. It was a portrait of God who calls to us every day to come to him, to strive with him over the challenges in our life. Lastly, in this study of the ways that God uses Jacob to show a portion of his own character, God shows us that he is faithful to his word and that he keeps his promises. Jacob's experienced God's faithfulness again and again. He would deliver him from Esau. He would deliver him from Laban. God delivered Jacob from famine and ultimately would use the poor choices of his sons to show him that he can even deliver back someone who he assumed to be dead to the land of the living. God is faithful. He will deliver. And he keeps his promises to Jacob. Reading God's word reveals to us time and time again that he shows his faithfulness and his ability to keep all of his promises. Jacob's life wasn't just some progression of time and experience that matured the mind of a man. It was God revealing to him that his ways are better. His life is good. He will deliver. And through it all, we can rely on his promises. Further time studying Jacob's life would reveal a great many ways in which God can talk to us about our lives, about the nature of this world, about sin, about dealings with one another. And here is this in this list of other lessons that we can take away from Jacob's life. Most importantly, adhering to the theme here that the elders have set about God having a plan for you. Jacob's life demonstrates here that as long as there is life, anyone can change. Anyone can change. And they do so by turning their face towards a faithful and caring God. I heard recently here in the Love and Respect class, which was a great class. If they do it again, please participate. It was wonderful. Stop being defeated by your defeats. If Satan can do anything in life, it would be to cause us to look back and be so burdened with what we have done that it is impossible for us to move forward onto what we could do for God. Consider Jacob. With all the faults that he had, wouldn't it have been easy for him to give up at any time? But he did not. And when he turned towards God, his character changed. I have found so much of myself in my study of Jacob, and I have done so many of the things that he did in the manner that he did them. Praise be to God, our Father in heaven, that he saw fit to record Jacob's life, that we might see God's character and how that turning towards him can and will change us. God has a plan for you. If you've turned away from him, will you now turn back to him? As Jacob made a vow to God and kept it, will you turn towards him and allow God to change your life? This time here is an invitation. It's open to you, and all that you need to do is come forward and respond to it. If you want to turn back towards God, you can do so now as we stand and as we sing.